He's always got the time.
Is that because of his... I can't say that.
He's got a watch every size of his
Zoom
watch.
into his watch. It's a great watch, but he's always got the time.
Footy is much more than just the players on the field, and in this episode, we take a look at the game from a different perspective. Introducing former CEO of 3 AFL clubs, Cameron Schwab. Cam, welcome to the pod. Thanks very much for coming on. We've only just met for the first time, which I find exciting. There's plenty to talk about.
No, there is. As a D's man, I don't know whether to apologise to you or to say that perhaps there was probably some of the things I was a part of, which perhaps as a young person growing up barracking for the Demons mightn't have given you quite the hope and the excitement that perhaps we thought we were going to have at different stages. But I had 15 years with the Demons, and they were probably 15 of the most impactful years of my working life, if not my life. Yeah.
It is funny when you put it like that. You certainly did feature in my childhood, really, barracking for the D's.
Yeah. How old are you?
I'm 27. So
27, yeah.
Yeah, not a lot of success. From grade 3 until my last year at uni, Melbourne didn't make the finals. So.
Didn't they? Yeah, no, well, that would have been... It's funny because I grew up, obviously, as a Richmond person with my father at Richmond, and then sort of I had a pretty good time of it growing up, and Tigers won 5 premierships in my lifetime, and then so then all the kids, and particularly my brother's kids, they barrack for the Tigers, and we often talk that there's probably a need for support groups of parents who force their children to barrack for the same clubs that they did, and then but 37 years later they got the reward and they got to win a premiership, and 57 years later the Demons, and my sister married a Mad Doggies supporter and they had theirs, so it all happened really quite quickly that all of these, families of kids who were forced to go and watch teams which would never win the premiership, all of a sudden, 3 of them delivered in a pretty short period of time.
It is amazing the journey that football takes you on. I guess we'll start with your journey. So started really young, jumped straight into it with the Richmond Footy Club. Do you want to talk us through?
Yeah, well, I started at Melbourne before that. I was at Melbourne when Barassi was coach. So straight from school I went, and it was the title of the role was assistant to the football manager. And I remember thinking to myself, and I was in year 12 I went to Camberwell Grammar, and my father was obviously in the game, Alan Schwab. He was a very well-known person in the sport, and I've got no doubt that my surname played a pretty big role, and probably for the right reasons, as in I genuinely had grown up with the game at a level that perhaps most young people hadn't experienced, and happy to talk about that. But there was a job halfway through my year 12, and I wasn't sure what I was going to do. I think I had it vaguely in my head I might do some form of marketing degree, or fine art was the other option at that time. And it was Barassi had just come back to Melbourne, and there was a lot of excitement around him, and it was the assistant to the football manager. I thought my career would be totally complete if I could get the 2 out of the title, and I just could be the assistant football manager for the rest of my life. That was pretty much how it was. And I remember meeting this guy, Dick Seddon, who was the CEO of the club, and he gave me my job description, but he said, well, it's really the job descriptions, do anything Ron Barassi asks you to do, and that might be the best job description I've ever had. And to be in his orbit at that stage of my life, from 18 through to, say, 23, 24, and someone who, I teach leadership now pretty much for a living, and he saw things in me that I'd never dreamt of in myself, and I think they're the most impactful people in your life. Who people you only ever bring one imagination to your own life, and people who bring their imagination and are prepared to perhaps open up options for you that you never thought was possible. And he did that, and I got into recruiting at Melbourne, and then we made the finals for the first time in 24 years, and I'd played a role in the recruitment of that team, and then things started to open up a little bit for me, and I went to then Richmond as CEO the following year. Yeah, and I was 24 when I took that role on.
Yeah. Incredible, really, starting at such a young age to jump into that CEO role. Yeah. What was it like at that time to be that young in football and in such an important role?
Yeah, I think it was always. I was mindful of it, definitely, and I was no prodigy or anything like that. I think a lot of people would think you must have had something really special, but there was never any evidence of that at any time. I did have a very unique growing up, and I think that's a big part of it. So even the Malcolm Gladwell 10,000 hours, I probably had that in the game itself, mostly through just taking in the environment of which I grew up in. And so my father, Alan Schwab, was Secretary of Richmond, and that was CEO. It's just title inflation. And so there were 3 times in my childhood, he was part of 3 premierships at Richmond, where I woke up on a Sunday morning and the Premiership Cup the Tigers had won was on our kitchen table, from the day before. And many mornings, and for me, it seems like most mornings after games, it would either be Dad going to Tommy Hafey's house, the great Richmond coach, or Tommy Hafey coming around to our house. And there was no replays for them to access or anything like that. They might have watched a bit of the game on the footy replay the night before, but they would replay the game to each other, their own observations on the game. They'd literally go quarter by quarter. And I'd sit there as a 10-year-old kid or an 8-year-old kid and I'd be able to take it all in. And my sense of the game was that they were talking in terms which were far different to what I was hearing when I heard, World of Sport or football commentary around the game. That they weren't talking as it was really quite pointed, very businesslike, very strong thinking, particularly at that era, about the prospects or otherwise of players of the team. And so my education in the game wasn't someone who was just watching the telly. I was doing all of that, plus I was getting this other thing. And I'd spend many of my holidays around, school holidays in and around Richmond, and Kevin Sheedy would be working there, and it was only really Dad and Kevin and one other person. That's how much footy had changed, or has changed. And Kevin would, I'd be in his offices, I'd be 10 or 11, and he'd go, who do you think we should play on Jezelenko this week? Or, which ruckman should play on John Nichols? And I'd always have an answer. Then he'd say, is that your answer? Is that did you read that in the paper, or did your old man tell you that? And he was really questioning me. And I found him to be like that almost then for the next 50 years of my life, in that way. So having that education and also recognising how hard the game was really early in the piece. It was certainly the glamour and the excitement was there for me, but also recognising what it felt like to be in a household where they'd lost a grand final when they were favourites, which they did one year, or to, Royce Hart was a great champion and my favourite ever player, for his career to finish after 170 games when you thought he was going to play forever. And all of that was just part of the day-to-day my existence. So I'm not sure whether Brassy or anyone recognised the uniqueness of that, but he gave me open doors for me, which I don't think I would have had opened for me unless he'd recognised something. And he was the one who encouraged me to do some recruiting, and it all changed from there. So coming in as a CEO at 24, going back to your original question, was that, so there was a big part of me which felt I had enough of the prerequisite of the game itself, but was always a learner, and I had the opportunity of working with some wonderful people there. But I certainly had no concept of what it meant to put myself into a place of leadership, other than I knew it was hard. That was the one thing I did. So I wasn't prepared for hard, but I was ready for hard. And from that perspective, and it was, Richmond were really struggling, and they were on the bottom of the ladder, and we had no money, and it was a very different club to the one my father was secretary of, that's for sure.
The role of a CEO in the AFL is such a highly scrutinised position.
Yeah.
You do have people talking, you're recognisable. How did you find the pressures of that?
Human nature is such that we need to recover quickly from challenging circumstances. Otherwise, we end up in a place which is unhealthy. And there's no doubt that happened for me. There were times when I did get myself into an unhealthy place. And I think it was mostly when I thought, all I have to do is outwork this thing. If I can just outwork it, I'll be okay. Well, you can't, The one thing that recruiting did, or being in recruiting, it actually served me far better than what I assumed it would be. So when I took on the CEO role at a young age, I felt that I had to create a whole new game for myself and a whole new way of operating and thinking. But really, as a recruiter, particularly in those days, and it was just when drafting was starting to come in, that you had to be really quite strategic. You had to, how does the coach want to play? What sort of players are going to fit well within that? What are the skill needs? What are the roles that we need? Say, for instance, a John Northey team, which was a very direct team, long kicking, don't fumble, got to be super competitors if you're going to play under him, which was really quite defining for me. That to play to have, say, Northey and Barassi as the two coaches I was recruiting for, both put a really high value on competitiveness, and so from that, and that came back out later actually when I brought Todd Viney back to do the recruiting, because he was always going to recruit really competitive people, and Jason Taylor, those people who then were able to put together the team which won it in 21. You start to at least forge and form enough confidence, from yourself to back your judgment in over what are pretty profound decisions for a club to make. Who we're going to recruit and who we're going to draft, how is that player. And those days we were drafting at 16 as well, so it was much more speculative. And then when I became a CEO, I almost tried to create this whole new game for myself, that how should a CEO behave? Well, really, the skills that I was forming for myself as a recruiting were actually the ones which were going to serve me best as a CEO. But I just didn't understand that at the time because I'd never done the job before. And I often say that to people now. Tell me what you're good at, and try and build your leadership game around what you're naturally good at.
You mentioned your involvement in hiring the likes of Jason Taylor and Todd Viney, which essentially gives you a bit of a fingerprint on all sorts of things that develop from there. So when Melbourne does win the flag in 2021, do you take pride? Is there
you do.
connection?
Yeah, you do, but you're not taking credit, if you know what I mean. There's little you're happy that, because there's a lot of things that we did during that time which were actually really quite profound, as in their impact on the game, like women's football emerged during that time through Debbie Lee and Jen Watt, who were just two great people in the game. We did a deal with the Bentley Club, which generated $31 million for the club, realigned with the MCC, which gave it a sense of identity back again, set up Amy Park and Casey. So they were all pretty important. And then from the football point of view, and when I first came back to Melbourne, and it was a role which was actually I didn't have any absolute desire for, because I'd actually been sacked there about 10 years earlier, so I never thought it was going to be an option. And it was pretty messy when I finished up. And but Jimmy Steins was president and pushed it pretty hard, and he was a very compelling person, and I couldn't have tried any harder. I know that, and but perhaps in hindsight, from a football perspective, it was always going to be really difficult because the coach had only just been appointed, the recruiting manager had only just been appointed, and generally, unless you've got very established versions of those things as a CEO, as in people who've got good track record, to come in after they've been appointed, it just was, and they were based at the Junction Oval. In hindsight, the one thing I never was able to do was to win the trust of those guys for whatever reason, and that created a problem then for the board, and to put me in a challenging situation, perhaps of my own making, but it was always going to make it a little bit difficult. And it wasn't until that sort of went through and we're able to make some changes the way that perhaps a bit more aligned to how I thought about it. And it's not right or wrong, it's just a different opinion. But it was the group that we put together at that time with Todd, with Jason, with Tim Lamb. They've had a profound effect on the Melbourne Footy Club. Like, they've probably had as big an effect on Melbourne as Jimmy Caldwell back in the day when he was recruiting the great teams of the 50s and 60s.
The CEO role is so large at an AFL club. How much impact do you think you can actually have on on-field performance? Like, it's probably not a role where you can necessarily hang someone out to dry because a team's bottom of the ladder.
Yeah, you're still responsible. And look, it varies too. Like, if it's me, it is because I'm from a football background. So there's a different scenario. If I'd come from a background which didn't have that, well, you could quite rightly say, well, really, I've put that in the hands of someone else.
Yeah, you're running the business.
Yeah. But I think you take responsibility for both. You're trying to create a profit model in some shape or form. And Melbourne, creating a profit model was always challenging because it's a small club. And I know that, it's wonderful, beautiful, deep heritage. It's the oldest. It's all of those things. But the numbers don't lie in that sense. What Melbourne's been outstanding at, even during really difficult phases, it has this amazing capacity to convert people who love the club into members, even when they're MCC members. So we actually did really well in all of those things. But the fact was, if there's 1 million Collingwood supporters, there's 250,000 Melbourne supporters. So it was always small. So building the profit model was an important part. Playing out of the MCG is a huge advantage, but it's also a massive disadvantage because you have limited access to some of the assets that you need to, to try and monetize to actually build the profit model. And really all your profit model is you're trying to build then a performance model, which is a premiership model, which eventually they got there, which is hopefully then strong enough and hangs around long enough that it actually improves the profit model. So it's that circular nature for it. So as CEO, you're responsible for all of those things, but very rarely have you got your hands directly on those levers. And that's probably one of the things which did change in the time that I was there. There was an expectation when I was first general manager or CEO at Richmond is that you actually had your hands on a lot of those levers, much less so over time. Like up until probably, I used to do the trading and I used to do all of those sorts of things, and then that I didn't do that after probably halfway through my stint at Freo because we employed full-time list managers. Well, we didn't have those initially. Yeah, so as the game grew, the depth of the decisions that you made changed, but the breadth definitely widened.
The club was at Junction Oval when you started.
Yeah,
You obviously moved across to Amy Park and Casey, but what was Junction like?
Junction was, it's like a lot of things. It's every so often people say to me, I used to love going to the footy in the old days where you could stand in the outer and you could do all that. Well, my experience of that as a young kid wasn't very positive. I love the folklore that I actually got to do it, but it's much more comfortable sitting at the MCG or Marvel and watching your team play in that environment. And so people might look at the Junction Oval, and by the way, we had some success from there. Like it's quite freaky, really. Under Neil Danaher and John Norther, we actually produced some regular finals teams during that time. But it was primitive, and there's an old saying that a 10-kilo dumbbell weighs the same in a nice gym as what it does in an old gym like we had down there. But you are really, as leaders, the most fundamental thing we're trying to do is create the conditions which enable a group of people to be the best they can be. That's the most fundamental thing that we're trying to do. And if you're doing it out of dilapidated facilities where you can't trust almost any element of it, whether the lights will turn on, whether the thing's going to flood, whether the possums are going to find their way into your office at some odd time, and you're competing with clubs who aren't faced with that. Well, clearly you're at a disadvantage. And I think there's sometimes we like to use that to our advantage and say it's us against them, and there is a little bit of that, but that starts to wear thin. And where it wears particularly thin is when you're actually competing for the services of players and you've got nowhere to take them, because you're ashamed of where you live. It's and there was a sense of that. And Amy Park was never going to be the perfect solution. Made it much closer to the MCG, which was great. There was no harder drive than trying to get from the MCG to Punt to the Junction Oval in peak hour traffic. Like it could literally take you an hour just to put your head in and say good day to people. And we used to walk across the footbridge. It was okay. It's certainly not perfect. The MCG offices are pretty spread out, so it's not ideal, but it's like quantifiably different. And the other thing it forced us to do was do the thing at Casey, and I think Casey has proved to have a great upside for the Ds. So that was a real risk we took. So I think all in all, the club's in much better space, but I can see why people think there's another place, another level that can actually go from that point of view. And you would have had that experience, and you're right, you would have been walked across that footbridge a million times. Yeah. But there's part of it which is, it's actually also to get across, walk over, clear your head. I found all of that to be okay, but it's not nearly as good as being able to, walk a couple of doors down and see how the coach is going, or to, check in on the footy manager or something like that.
Yeah, for sure. Do you think now, obviously, you've made the move from Junction to Amy, it was probably a short-term fix. Do you think it's a disadvantage now that the Ds are still there when you do see Collingwood next door and Richmond across the road?
Certainly not an advantage. It's one of those disadvantages which would be hard to measure, but I think it would be far more marginal than what it was. There's no perfect setups, and I've travelled to most of the major sporting clubs around the world, and you're amazed at how similar they sort of are in lots of ways. Like even going to some of the the great clubs, there's still parts of it which are just still the same. There's no doubt if there was another level it could go. What basically happened during that time is that Melbourne had been operating in one way or another with disadvantage in terms of its training. And I was around long enough to the days when we trained at the MCG. And the centre square was always roped off when we trained. All the practice wickets were roped off. So you had Ron Barassi in the middle of the MCG with Robbie Flower, these great players running around, and with picket posts in the middle of the ground so the players didn't run onto the centre wicket. It was compromised. So you try and do end-to-end drills so we moved to the Junction Oval and it was small. And it was probably served its purpose for that first period, but then the clubs grew. And so Melbourne effectively had been operating in that way with disadvantage for the best part of 40 years. Amy Park and Casey, in its own way, was the first time we could actually say we're no longer operating with disadvantage. What most other clubs are seeking to do is to try and operate with advantage.
Yeah.
Okay, well, it hasn't achieved that. So I can understand the appetite the club actually has, and we've actually also now got the we came out then the funding with a future fund to actually, as a result of the Bentley Club arrangement, where they can actually look at this stuff quite proactively, and whether it's negotiating to try and get in the middle of Caulfield or all of that stuff makes sense for me. But it is also nice to be in the shadows of the MCG. I think that was always a lovely aspect of it, that to actually be operating from the stadium that you play at. There's not many. Geelong's the only other club, I think, doing that. Yeah, is actually operating from the Gold Coast are right next to theirs, so they're pretty close. There wouldn't be many though, would there? Yeah. So to actually say we operate from the MCG is pretty cool. Yeah.
The we did come out there.
Yeah.
You're still a Melbourne person. Obviously, you've been at different clubs.
I actually think of each of the environments. Well, Melbourne, I spent the longest time. So Richmond was the club I barracked for growing up, and I just found myself drawn to that part of myself when I finished, but not in the way that it would be for someone who'd spent their whole life at the club. So if someone asks me, I say I barrack for Richmond. I support Richmond, and I've got which kid's your favourite sort of mindset. In some ways, I know that when I was in the roles, I was just so deeply invested in them. I loved the Melbourne stuff. I loved the fact that we were the first club. I loved the fact that there was Ron Barassi I got to work with, and I got to have a relationship with him for the rest of my life. I loved the Norm Smith story. We're getting to meet your John Beckless and Hassan Mans, but even from time to time, I can still be. I'll be walking through Chadstone or something like that, and someone will come over and say good day to me, and I'll look at them and I go, I know someone's in whoever I'm looking at, but it'll be someone who might have played in our under-19s when I was recruiting manager, and was just so thankful for the fact that they played 10 under-19 games in the 80s, and you played, and they want to thank you for the fact that you identified them and brought them down, and you can sit there and talk.
You've met a lot of people through footy.
Yeah, but that part of their life was arguably as important and meaningful as any part. It's like talking to you. That part of your life will be part of your life forever. And the fact that you got to experience the premiership and be there for it, that's there. And it might be forgotten by a whole lot of other people, but it's always there for you. And that's the important thing. So, from my point of view, to have spent, and I had 3 stints there, at really impactful periods of my life, and that for my family. But I grew up as a Richmond person, and my great-grandfather played in Richmond Premiership. There's a whole lot of that heritage there. But I'd also say probably the most joyful time was actually at Freo as well, to spend 8 years in a whole different city and to be part of a team which made the finals for the first time. And so it's not, and I'm sure that the amazing thing about a Barassi is that he's a life member of 4 AFL clubs. Mm-hmm. He always felt Melbourne to me, but I'm sure North think of him as theirs, and Carlton think of him as theirs, and even the Swans think of him as theirs. And and I don't think any club would certainly want to lay any claim over me, but I certainly lay claim over them.
Yeah.
That they played a really big part of my life during important phases of my life, whether it's my kids growing up or whatever it might have been.
For sure.
Yeah.
How about when you end, your relationship with the club ends,
Yeah.
whether it's sacked, resigned,
Yeah.
however it may be,
Yeah.
how does the initial feeling sit with you?
So the first time it happened, I really struggled. It was a challenging period of life. My father had passed away suddenly and in bad circumstances. And so when I finished at Melbourne, it was handled in a way which I found out via the media. It just was messy. And also I was going through a challenging phase, full stop. And I didn't handle it very well at all. Not in a blaming sort of way, but there probably was an element of that. I've never been someone who carries anger much, but I have a tendency to carry sadness. I think I was just sad. Yeah.
The first time you joined the club was around that merger time.
It was post-merger, yeah.
What was it like joining fresh off the merger?
Messy. Club was a mess. Because remember, Melbourne actually, in a controversial way, people would actually question whether it was legitimate or not, but Melbourne actually voted for the merger. The only reason the merger doesn't happen is because Hawthorn voted against it. Okay, so it takes two to tango. So there was definitely two camps in at the club, which was a pro and anti-merge group. Personally, I was always of the view the club shouldn't merge. So I had that, but I wasn't so judgmental as to, because some of the people who'd made the call to merge are some of the finest Melbourne people who've ever walked this earth. Ian Ridley being president, Hassaman CEO. There are not many greater Melbourne people in their history. Ian, I think he's one of the legends, the living legend. I think he's not a living legend, he's passed away, but he's one. I think there's only about 5 or 6, and he's in that group. So he's right up there. Great place, 5 premierships, coached the club, president of the club. That's a unique record. And one of the most emotional, intellectual, capable people that I ever got to know. And he made the choice that the club should merge. So you have to have respect for that, and copped a lot of abuse for it. And his book, Urge to Merge, it's almost tragic in some ways, So then to come in after that, at least I come in after it with a platform to try and fix it. So and there's clear need to fix it. Melbourne financially wasn't going as bad as what Hawthorn was, and it's interesting how the two clubs responded, because Melbourne's response to it is to find a white knight. Hawthorn's response to it is to rebuild its football club. And my experience with white knights is not very positive, I must admit. Hawthorn rebuilt a great club, under Ian Dicker at the time. But we actually had more success early. We finished last the next year, and then made the preliminary final the year after that under Neil Danaher, and then I got the sack the year after that. That's how quickly it happened. Yeah. So heads were spinning.
Yeah.
That's literally how quickly it happened. Yeah. And I often reflect on that. So you pick up a club which is almost merged. We finished last because the club was so fragmented. We got within a game of the grand final, and 8 months later I was sacked. Yeah.
Seems remarkable in hindsight.
It does, yeah. That's probably where it came from. But to its credit, the club bounced back and under Neil, and they did make the grand final the next year. So we were probably doing some pretty good work, even though that was all happening. So I look at that and think, well, how did that happen, really? But it did. That's the facts. And so that was probably something I did struggle with at the time. But I now put it down to one of the many of the great lessons that the game gave me. And I'm lucky that I had a lot of love and care around me to support myself through it. And by the way, I wasn't the first, and I certainly won't be the last person who left the game or left the club on circumstances other than of their own desire in that way. That'll always be there. Yeah. So hopefully there's and I've got enough humility in the way I've explained it. Yeah. Yeah.
We see so much of Neil Danaher in the media at the moment. You obviously spent a lot of time with him. How was your working relationship?
Yeah, great.
What was he like at the club?
Yeah, wonderful. He was hard, genuinely hard. He was a great person to work with, yeah. But, you had to he had high expectations of you. If you were going to have a conversation with him where you were going to question any aspect of his approach, or you'd want to be able to back it up, I'd know that. But I had nothing other than a really positive relationship. I did a little bit I did an MBA when I finished at Richmond, and I did a little bit of consulting work with Fremantle when it first formed. It was a very informal sort of part of it. But part of it was because I was in Melbourne, they were over there. I'd go around and Neil Danaher was at Essendon at the time, and I spoke to him about coming over and working at Fremantle. So I got to know him a little bit during that period. And we were the first club, when Neil was appointed, we were the first club to do one of those really comprehensive recruitment processes. And there were 4 people we recruited. We spoke to Greg Hutchison, who was the interim coach, Peter Schwab, Damien Drum, and Neil Danaher. All 4 of them coached league footy. Yeah. So it was a good thing and a good process. And Neil came out on top, and it was the strength of the character. Pretty sure in the way he wanted to play. His capacity to come into an environment where the team only won 4 games and be so clear on his expectations, not only on how we want to play or how we wanted to play, but on standards in and around the group, was just exactly what we needed. And you could almost feel it in about February that we were going to be a lot better. And then it was a year where we had some highs. We had a few lows. We got whacked a couple of times. But I remember a game we were playing West Coast, who were a very good side, in Perth, and we had a lot of players out injured, but a couple coming back. Stephen Tingay came back and played, but it was guys like Russell Robertson had only just started playing, and we beat them over there and it was such an impressive win that you could almost see in the bus going back to the airport that we just might have taken a really powerful step. And then we had a good run into the finals. We won both our finals. And then probably the only team we were going to struggle to beat was North Melbourne, and they had a really good side. Yeah, Carey, McKernan, those guys, Archer, just great side. And they were just too good for us on preliminary final day. But we actually had a couple of blokes who, in the last part of the game, we beat St Kilda in the final. Jeff White was just playing outstanding football, and I think from memory tore his posterior cruciate in the last part of the game, and we tried to play him the next week, and he just couldn't jump like he normally did, and he was really emerging as a player at that time. And we got beaten probably pretty comfortably in the end. And North were clearly the best team in it, but then they played Adelaide in the grand final and kicked themselves out of it the first part of the game. Adelaide win the premiership. We've beaten Adelaide by 10 goals 2 weeks earlier. Yeah. So it was in hindsight, we could have easily won the premiership. We could have gone from last to premiership, yeah, which would have been incredible. Yeah.
Amazing how football works.
It is, yeah.
You have spoken about so many sort of iconic Melbourne names. Jim Stynes was another one that you worked very closely with. Yeah. What was your relationship with Jim like? Yeah, no,
I've known him for a long time. So Ron Barassi and Barry Richardson were doing the Irish experiment and it literally was that. And that came about through, my father was involved with that as well. And it came about because Ron Barassi toured with a team called the Galahs back in the day, yeah, and he went over and they played the guys in Ireland. Always had a sense that the guys could convert. And the year before, brought over Sean White, who played an under-19 premiership side, and literally get the call because I'm just the assistant to the footy manager. That we're bringing over 2 young guys from Ireland. Can you go and pick them up at the airport? And I went and picked up Jim Stynes and a guy James Fahey at the same time, and if someone had said to you then that they'd have this chance. The interesting thing about Jim, he actually grew when he came over here, and he always put it down to the nutrition, that he's from a family of 1 million people. They'd have one chicken and they'd spread it out, and he reckons he spent his whole childhood hungry. Whereas he came over and we boarded him in I think it was in Ivanhoe from memory, the Caddy family, and so I had to find board for him. And he was at the barbecue for the first day there, and they said, "Do you want more, Jim?" And he reckons it's the first time he'd ever been asked that question in his whole life. And so he actually grew. So he was tall, athletic, but ended up being ruckman size, and makes a big difference. Yeah. And the very first time we were running around, it was Albert Park Lake. We were based at the Junction, and we're running the whole team around. This is the senior guys, and you got some guys who can really scurry in an AFL environment. Well, he won it, yeah. Or he might have actually let someone pass him because he thought he was going to get lost. So there's some story around that from memory. And so we realised we had this guy who was probably 6'5", 6'6" at the time would end up being 6'7", 6'8", who was probably the best runner in the club. And then the ball handling came out. He could handle the ball and just needed to learn how to kick it. And he was such a hard worker. But he always had very much his own views, and he was prepared because he came out of different environments. And Sean White was the same as this. That they'd often say, "How can we train this way?" I played this role, but you're asking me to train like that player. And we would be, I'll pull your head in, you know nothing about it sort of stuff. But they're actually they're right. Whereas if you look at programs now, they're very much individualised around the athlete. And then obviously became a terrific player. I was there at 87 when he ran across the mark. I was part of all of that.
How was that day?
We talked about sadness before. In terms of just a pure football experience, that was the saddest day of my time. Yeah. Because the siren had gone. We'd won the game. We're in the grand final. We would have got belted, by the way, the next week. We just run out of players. But I was recruiting manager, and there was a little bit of anger in it because, the umpire hadn't heard the siren out on the ground, and, the siren had well and truly rung by the time, but none of the players, no one heard it. So what's the point getting angry? But the siren's actually rung so people can hear it. That's actually, I actually had that at Fremantle with Siren Gate years later. But yeah,
another interesting day.
Yeah, and I remember sitting in the car and with my girlfriend at the time on the way out, and we might have had a couple of drinks in the after-match function or whatever it was. Just crying. I just bawled my eyes out because we hadn't made the finals forever. It was a real hodgepodge of players we dragged from everywhere. Some of them come out of our under-19s. Guys, they were second and third chances. We had some young stars coming through. We didn't know how good they were, but we actually, our biggest young star, Gary Lyon, had broken his leg. It was just like a tragedy. But as it turned out, we would have played in the grand final the next week without Flower, without Warren Dean, without some of our best players. Brian Wilson was injured. We would have struggled to put a team together the next week in a grand final.
Are you someone who remembers a lot of games this deeply? Like,
remember that one?
Are there favourite wins? Are there?
Yeah. No, so games like that one. See, I don't know if Melbourne people would remember that game in Perth, but those ones definitely. No, there's ones where I can watch a replay of a game on YouTube, and I sometimes will dig them out, and it's like I'm watching them for the first time. I've got no memory. I couldn't tell you whether we won or lost. But the ones which were the defining games, I'm there again, and that's in all environments. It was interesting because in those days I was recruiting, so I didn't actually watch Melbourne play very often because all games were played on Saturday afternoons. Well, the teams I was actually watching to play to recruit players from, they were also playing Saturday afternoons. So what would happen would I'd go and watch a game in Shepparton or whatever. I'd drive back and I'd catch up with the players because they always had a dinner afterwards or something like that. And I'd go and catch up with them, and because I was the same age as the players as well, I was the same. So guys like Todd Viney, Gary Lyon, Chris Connolly, they've become sort of good friends in life because I was pretty much, they were like my uni mates in some ways, and stayed in tight with them all these years. And then I'd actually find out whether I'd listen to the radio on the way home whether we'd won or lost, and then get back. But I'd never watch the game. I'd sit and watch the game with the coaches on the Monday, and that was how I'd watch the games. So I hardly saw Melbourne play for about 4 years when I was in recruiting, because it was just conflicting.
Football brings you so many highs, so many lows.
Yeah.
I'm guessing one of the lowest points was the loss to Geelong, 186 points.
Yeah, because we were fragmenting as a club. The scoreboard only told part of the story, but we'd fragmented as an organisation.
And there was pressure on you around that time as well?
Yeah. No, pretty much I'd been told that I wasn't staying,
And then that flipped pretty quickly.
They did,
How did that week sort of play out?
What happened really, because I pretty much I remember, I'd pretty much, it just got really messy. It got confused and out of control, really. And then the club came back and said, look, we think we've made a mistake, and asked me to come back, and I did, but it was no doubt, it was, and you always got to, the one thing, one of my mantras in leadership is it's a simple idea. It's all on you, as in the responsibility sits with you and on you when you're in those sorts of roles particularly, but it's never about you, and that time you have to live that, So the responsibility for something which wasn't going well as a football club during that time, clearly you take your responsibility for that. I'm CEO. Was it complex? Was it layered? Was it messy? Was it? Yeah, it was. But that's actually what you're signing up for, But then the discomfort is when it becomes about you, and I'm not naturally, and people might be surprised with that because they see you as being an upfront and all of that. But I'm actually relatively low-key, conversational sort of person, in the main. And it might have been that, I'd always, because I was a son of, and there was always another element to what I brought in the role that I played. But that was certainly, again, that was sad, yeah. But we grew from it, I think, and that's what the game will always do. It'll always give you lessons, and I realised I had to change my approach, and perhaps others did as well, and we learn, and it's not about any of us really. It's about the thing that you fell in love with. That's what it's about. That we had. How old were you at that stage?
Would have been, was 2011, year 8.
Yeah. So you've made a decision at whatever stage. How come you barrack for the D's? Is it family? Or? Yeah. You probably had no choice.
No.
Yeah. So that's what we're honouring. The people who love the club, who just about every aspect of their life will change other than the team they barrack for. They can change anything. And, I'm talking about everything now. People who I know, I've got a child who changed gender, same footy club. So everything changed. And those who play it, that's what we do it for. Because if you happen to be good enough to play it and you're in an environment where you get to play it, surely our responsibility is give those people the best chance to have the best careers they possibly can. That's really what it's about. And we weren't doing that. And we weren't doing it for you as a year 8 kid either. So we were failing in what the fundamental responsibility is when you're in the roles that we were in, of which I was in an important one. So does that mean it was easy? Well, of course it doesn't. It was complicated. It was layered. It was complex. There were lots of ambiguities. But really, leadership is about those very conditions. Yeah, and so we handled the next phase only okay. But I think we probably got a few things right and a few things wrong from that point onwards as well.
Obviously, Dean Bailey was sacked on the back of that game.
Yeah.
Mark Neild was brought in the next year. I actually had Cale Morton on last week. He spoke a bit about Mark Neild, but what was that process like? Obviously, it didn't end well, but...
Yeah, it didn't. And that's not saying we didn't do the right thing or whatever. And Mark was a really well-credentialed coach who interviewed unbelievably well, and so you make a choice in regard to that. But he didn't work out. Was Plan B any better? That's the other question, because there wasn't many other coaches who then came through. I think Ken Henkley was the other one who came through at that time. He's done a really good job with Port, but not many others. There was that. So there was a series of options available to us, and we chose that one, and it didn't work out.
And there's also so much for him to work with at that time as well.
Yeah, and we'd become really quite fragmented. But there was definitely it would have been a difficult period for the players. There's no doubt. But there were some wonderful other people who were introduced during that time, including the recruiting structure that we set up. See, Mark is the reason Jason Taylor comes in. So without Mark Neild, there's no Jason Taylor. Without Jason Taylor, there might not be a premiership. Would that be fair?
Yeah, I think he'd love that.
Yeah.
No, he's a fantastic recruiter.
Yeah, but I think that the only reason Jason Taylor comes in is on the back of Mark Neild's recommendation because he worked with him at Collingwood. I didn't know him. Whether we would have made the same choice or not, I'm not sure. Bringing Todd back was really important, I thought, during that time, a bit before that, because he just brought a clear-headedness, a calmness, but a forcefulness, which comes from he'll do a great job with the Kangas, with a terrific footy intellect, but also a really high set of expectations and standards around what sort of organisation we wanted to be. And perhaps that was my major issue that I had at the time. I don't think we were clear on that. And maybe we had to go through a whole process to get clear on it. Maybe we couldn't have got there without going through what we went through. Sometimes we can be very judgmental on unsuccessful periods, but the growth which comes from that is then often the platform for because we learn so much about each other and we learn what works and what doesn't work during those times. We probably learn a whole lot more about ourselves if we've got the type of environment which can have the conversations that it needs to have. And that was probably the issue. We weren't probably good at that, having the sorts of conversations we needed to have to get better at what we need to get better at. And that's no judgment on anyone. It's just, it's hard. And we were coming from so far back. You know, what Neil Danaher was able to do with what they had, you know, what Craig Cameron and as a recruiting guy was able to do with what they had, what Chris Fagan and those sorts of people were able to do during that period was quite remarkable. But eventually it fell apart. Yeah.
So since your time at the Melbourne Footy Club, what has life been like for you?
Yeah, well, I've had I studied fine art for a few years. Yeah, that was interesting. So I did. I enjoyed that, and so that was really a take on exploring other aspects of my. My mum was an artist, and my mum is an artist. Probably was now. She's now 80. And Dad was a footy administrator. So I probably. Even though I followed, obviously, my passion for the sport, I'm probably actually more like my mum's side of the family and my dad's side of the family in terms of how I am. And so I got to do that. And then started to get my mojo back because people started having conversations, wanting to get ideas around thinking around leadership and all of that. And then I thought there could be a business in this, you know. So I've about 7 or 8 years ago formed a business called Design CEO, where I basically coach and mentor leaders, and it's a really good thing to do, you know. So you basically, really what I've tried to do is make sense of all the experiences we've had even as we've talked today. I don't give advice, but I just share ideas as part of it all. And sometimes it's so if I was mentoring you, there might be days I'm just a sounding board for you. You know, you might have something you want to bounce off, and other days, you know, you might want some thinking, some new ideas, and we sit down and I share some ideas with you. Other days you might need a little bit of truth telling, as in, you know, maybe you haven't thought about this enough, or maybe you need to do more work on it and go a bit deeper than what you have. And then there's days where you sort of partner with the person a little bit and try and work stuff out together. So my approach to leading and coaching leadership is based on those sort of 4 domains. And so I've done a little bit of, so it's mainly CEOs and their teams is most work I do out of footy, but I've done a little bit of footy. I've been coaching Michael Voss for the last couple of years and doing a little bit of stuff with the Blues, which there's a bloke who's historically Richmond is they were the mortal enemy growing up, that's for sure. Yeah. So, but he's an unbelievably curious person and great person to coach, and I can't, we don't catch up weekly or anything like that, but I think. It seems that we can have some conversations from time to time which are important for him at important times, which I think all people need to have someone in their life who are like that. And I didn't know him at all before all of this came about, but I've got to know him really quite well. And I've enjoyed watching them and they had that challenging year last year where they lost a lot of games and then finished with a real rush. And then they've had the challenging moments this year, a lot of injuries, and managed to rebuild themselves and currently sitting second. And, you know, they're giving themselves every chance. Yeah.
That's great. And then you touched on the art side of things. So I actually stumbled across a few of your posts on social media, a recent one of Alex Pearce, quite incredible likeness in it. Is that something you've worked on the side throughout your whole career? Is it something
I always drew.
had?
So I was like the kid in the class. You know, you got a kid in the class who can draw a bit. Yeah. I was that kid in the class, and it was mostly growing up. It was always footballers and superheroes, and they were sort of done. And so my art's quite comic book like now, and that's no accident. How I like to draw. It's a pretty rough line. But so I'll be watching a game. So there's times it's just trying to reflect an emotion of a moment is probably the main piece within sport. I do a lot of art which isn't sport, but and I can literally be watching a game and see something and go, you know, I remember there was one. It was a couple of years ago. Jack Viney just burst through a tackle at one stage, and it was like, I'm thinking Jack Viney's the only bloke in footy who could actually have just done what he did. Can you capture that? And somehow it's his low to the ground, his resilience, the Viney genetics or something. You just want to try and capture the power of what he was presenting. The Alex Pearce one, I don't know Alex at all. but my Fremantle background. But there was something so profound about, that moment. He's kicked the 5th goal of his career. He's got them back in the game. One of his best mates, or if not his best mate, I'm not sure how close they were, Cam McCarthy, has died at 29 years of age just a couple of weeks before. They've had to play that day with all the emotion of it. He's an Indigenous man wearing an Indigenous Freo jumper. There's just so much happening there, yeah. And when he put his arm in the air, it was almost, he looked like a comic book superhero. He could have been Aquaman or Thor, or he could have been any of those things. This big, strong, handsome 6'7" bloke with his arm in the air, yes, saluting his past teammate. And the interview straight afterwards with Abby Holmes, he did a great job with it. He said, when I went back and I was having the shot for goal, I think he said something like, Cam would have kicked this. Cam would kick this. That was his inspiration in that moment. There's just so much happening in that thing. And I've got a copy going over to Alex too, so he touched base with me after he saw it on social media. And so, again, that's a little bit of a renewal of a relationship with the Fremantle Footy Club, which I loved. So it's mainly that, so in the footy sense, often it's just images from my childhood I just loved, and, drawing of Royce Hart. I've done a drawing this week. It's the celebration, Richmond's 1974 premiership reunion, which I'm going along to. I've become sort of the proxy Alan Schwab on the day, and I've done a drawing of Francis Burke for that, who's been a really important person in my life. And so that's I think his image, being chased by Doug Wade, sort of captures that era, the resilience of the Tigers and of that period of which is a great part of their history.
Fantastic. Just before we finish up, obviously there's been so many different elements to your life, which has been so fascinating to hear, and a different side of footy as well. I've spoken to a lot of players.
We've been far more serious than I normally am.
But you've also mentioned prior to coming on that you've got a podcast as well. So
yeah, I have. Yeah. So
So
we've set up a podcast, and it's called In the Arena, and it's a play on the famous Teddy Roosevelt speech. It's not the critic who counts, and we've talked a little bit about that today. It's and it is the man in the arena. It was written in an era where it was probably thought of as the man in the arena, but the person who puts themselves in the arena is prepared to get their face muddied and bloodied. And, I've got a little line, never trust a leader without a limp is the line. Never trust a leader without a limp, as in probably most of the conversation today has been about my limp as much as anything, the things which have challenged you at different times, but I also know that's where the growth's happened and that's where the love's tested. And if you live long enough and love hard enough, you're going to get your heart broken at different times. And so the people I'm talking to, I've spoken to, are people who have had that experience of being in the arena, often the sporting arena. So far, I've got Michael Voss as probably the first one, but had a great catch up the other week with Lauren Burns, who won the gold medal taekwondo in the 2000 Olympics and has gone on and has studied. She's a PhD on the difference between athletes, often success and failure, and her PhD revealed that connection is such a key part of it. People who are able to maintain really strong personal connections in their life was actually one of the most defining aspects of people's success in their careers as athletes, which is fascinating, I reckon, because often a lot of the conversation today has been about my connection with people. Yeah, John Bertrand, the whole country stopped when we won a boat race, quite extraordinary. And then obviously more contemporary people I'm going to spend time with. But I like people who have had the experience and then had the opportunity of reflecting on the experience. So the benefit potentially of me talking to you today is that I've done some reflection, because I think you get to that stage of life where you have, but the reflection comes from the fact that I now teach leadership, so I've done a bit of sense making from the experiences that I've actually had, and I think if you get to do that, where you actually really are teaching, and that's so the most generous people I've ever had the opportunity of working around were people who had done the work to make sense of the experiences they had and were offering them up as potentially something that someone else could learn from. Yeah. So that's what In the Arena is going to be about. So I'm looking forward to releasing that the next couple of weeks.
Yeah, very exciting.
Yeah.
Well, I really appreciate you coming on. It's funny when you try and land different guests, you don't really know where they're going to go, but everyone's got a story, and I've learned a lot about yours, and I feel like we probably could have chatted for a few more hours and learned a bit more, but I've taken up plenty of your time on a Thursday night, so really appreciate you coming on.
Congratulations on putting it together, and I think you get some really good stuff, and you never know what meaning people get from it at the other end. Someone might have a laugh, someone might actually write a little quote down, and it's because you've got the courage and the generosity to put your stuff out to the world. So well done.
Thanks, Cam. Really appreciate it.
Cheers.